announcements. Biology colloquium today, Jordan Lehman will be talking about something that she did. Biology senior, Jordan Lehman will be presenting biology colloquium today. Problem set 3 is due this Sunday at 1:30 p.m. at the desk. It's posted on Moodle and there's hard copies over there if you haven't picked one up already. I'm about halfway through the exams, so I hope to have them fully graded by the end of the day tomorrow. I'll post the grades to Moodle as soon as I have them all done, and you can pick them up from me when if you're interested, go to Moodle and see if the grade is posted. That means it's done, and then I can give it to you. There is a option for the Brain Explorers extra credit if you were unable to attend. And I know that some people wanted to attend but were unable to. And so to be fair, there's a description on Moodle of what you can do for the equivalent extra credit if you were unable to attend. I don't need to know why you were unable to attend, but if you do this problem, it's an essay about what exploration station you would make if you were to make one. That's the equivalent. So you'll see a description. Feel free to ask me any questions about that option. No. So the question has frequently come up, what are the extra credit, what's the extra credit value? And I haven't made a final decision. So here are my constraints. The people who organized Brain Explorers put in a lot of time. The people who did actually present it put in quite a bit of time because the thing was 4 hours long. And so they put in 4 hours. So the organizers put in lots more than 4 hours. The people who presented put in 4 hours, and the people who attended put in 1 to 2 hours. So I'm trying to scale the extra credit appropriately. So if I gave the people who attended 2 extra credit points on an exam, which seems pretty minimal, but that means I'm giving the presenters 4 extra credit points, which isn't minimal, and I would give organizers 8 extra credit points, which is not minimal at all. So those are my constraints. But that gives you a sense of what I'm leaning towards.
Do you actually want to give us only 2 points, or is that just hypothetical?
No, that's pretty close to what it's going to be. 2 points for 1 hour of work seems about right. Yeah.
So would the extra credit for attending be the writing user?
That's right.
So you would assume that people who are gone might have been for 2 hours, so that means we get 4 points?
No, 2 hours. 1 to 2 hours is what I think the exploration station was worth, and that's 2 credit points, 2 extra credit points. Yeah.
So is that the one exam that we just took in the next exam?
Yes. It doesn't matter, right?
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, you're right. I guess it doesn't matter.
So when you get your exam back, it will not include the extra credit points. That's just something on my grading sheet. So if you want to know whether did I get your card or did I get your essay here, just ask me. So now that I think about it, I might scale things up more than a 2, because if I were to scale, never mind, it's a complicated equation. Okay, so today we're continuing with endocrinology. We are, this might be the most important class in endocrinology, period. Because what we're going to be talking about are control mechanisms for endocrinology. The hypothalamus in the brain and the pituitary gland, just below the brain, are the most important control units of the endocrine system. So understanding what we're doing today is, like I said, might be the most important thing for the whole set of classes about the endocrine system. We'll talk about the hormones that are released by the hypothalamus. So this is part of so these are neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus. We'll talk about the hormones released by the cells of the anterior and posterior pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is really two parts, anterior and posterior. They're pretty different, and they release different hormones. So we talk about them differently. We will talk about the circulation, the blood flow that connects the hypothalamus release site with the pituitary. It's called the portal circulation. And then we'll start to talk about one of the specific actions of the hypothalamus and pituitary, which is called the HPA axis, for the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal gland. So we'll talk about it, one specific set of endocrine steps related to the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and then a target gland, the adrenal gland. And this is the stress response. So this is the most interesting one for you now, dealing with the stress of the last few weeks of your semester that I am contributing. So here is a midline sagittal section through a body, through a head, not just through a brain. So you can see brain structures, and you can see this is the tongue, and here is the, I guess that's the spinal cord, right? So here's the spinal cord, and here are vertebra cut with some muscles, and here is the esophagus, nasopharynx, sinus, two sinuses, 1, 2, 3 sinuses in the skull. Here's the nasal cavity, teeth, etc. So you a hard palate above the mouth, mandible, bone. So I'm just getting you oriented. Muscles of the neck, some of which you know. I should be able to show you this picture, and you should be able to label it with a lot of labels, right? Corpus callosum, fornix, thalamus probably, the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, cannot see the temporal lobe, etc. So this is a good slide to do some review of neuroanatomy. The point I want to make from this slide is that here is the so what is this white matter right here? What is the white matter right here? That's a tricky one. That's the optic chiasm, cut in cross-section. The hypothalamus and the pituitary are right behind and below the optic chiasm. So this is the hypothalamus here. So thalamus, hypothalamus, pituitary. The pituitary in our brain, in our cadaver's brain, is still in the skull because it's in this little pocket of bone. And when we took this brain out, we tore the structure that connected the hypothalamus to the pituitary, and left the pituitary in the skull and took the brain and took the hypothalamus out. So there was getting the pituitary out with the brain is very hard because you have to cut bone in order to do it. The pituitary is nestled in this little pocket of bone. It's got a name. I'm not sure I remember it, so I'm not going to say it. Yes?
So the pituitary and hypothalamus is anterior to the thalamus, and it's posterior to the optic chiasm?
Yep. That's about right. Okay, questions about the actual physical gross anatomy? So here's a cartoon of that connection. The hypothalamus, this blob here is supposed to be the optic chiasm. the hypothalamus, the stalk connecting it to the pituitary gland. The stalk has a name, it's got two names. It's called the infundibulum, which is a fun word to know, and median eminence, which is another fun word. Median eminence, sounds like a rock band or something. So, and these green, balloons are supposed to be neurons, right? These are the cell bodies of hypothalamic neurons sending their axons to the median, to and through the median eminence. The to and through here is important because some of the this is now key information. Some of the hypothalamic neurons send their axons to the median eminence and release their hormone into the portal circulation, portal microcirculation of the median eminence, or of the infundibulum. The median eminence is the release site, the infundibulum is this structure. So some hypothalamic neurons release their hormone in the median eminence, where it gets into blood, the portal circulation, and that blood carries it to the anterior pituitary. Some of the hypothalamic neurons send their axons through the infundibulum, and their release sites are in the posterior pituitary, where they just release it into blood, where it goes to the whole body. So some of the hormones of the hypothalamus are released into a circulation, and the target is right there. It's the anterior pituitary. And some of the hypothalamic neurons are releasing their hormone into systemic blood. It's going into the whole body. So we have to think about two different bloods. It's all the same blood, but there's blood in the portal circulation that is really focused on taking micro volumes of blood from the median eminence to the anterior pituitary. And then there's systemic blood that's going everywhere, from the pituitary to the whole body. Okay? So we've talked about the so-called the portal blood vessels, this portal microcirculation. Officially it's called the hypothalamic pituitary portal microcirculation, because we have another portal circulation in the liver. But we're not covering that here, of course. We're covering all you need to do is call it the portal circulation. And it carries a set of hormones from different hypothalamic neurons from the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary. But of course those hormones are going everywhere, because they're hormones, they're getting into blood, but their target is the anterior pituitary. Why is this the target? Because the anterior pituitary cells express the receptors for these hormones. Other hypothalamic neurons are releasing their hormone in the posterior pituitary. Here are the hormones that are released in the posterior pituitary. They're called pituitary hormones, but they were synthesized in the hypothalamus, transported to the release sites. So, we'll call these the hormones of the posterior pituitary, but they're qualitatively different. At least, they are different from the hormones of the anterior pituitary, because these were released directly into blood flow, and these required blood flow, binding of receptors, and then another release event into the systemic circulation. Okay, is that clear?
So do both of them require that portal network, or is it just the anterior?
Just the anterior pituitary requires the portal circulation. So this is an important slide to solidify into your understanding. It's got the names of hormones, it's got which are important for release into the portal circulation, the names of hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary, and the names of hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary. Yes?
So, the ones for the anterior pituitary, the neurons send the axons to the median eminence where they release neurotransmitter,
Hormone?
hormone. And then from there, they go in that bloodstream down to the anterior pituitary where they release hormone.
Where the cells of the anterior pituitary bind these hormones, respond to that binding, and release other hormones. So these, let's be clear, these are called hypothalamic releasing hormones. And these are the hormones of the anterior pituitary that are released by the anterior pituitary. And these are the hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary. So these are hypothalamic releasing hormones, and they're called releasing hormones because their job is to trigger the anterior pituitary to release pituitary hormones, anterior pituitary hormones. So the targets of these hormones are the anterior pituitary cells, and the targets of these hormones are widespread throughout the body. Kendra?
So there's no direct connection to that.
Well, direct, I mean, there's no innervation of hypothalamic neurons into the anterior pituitary. That's true. So now we're going to make sense of this alphabet soup of hormones. All of these abbreviations are words that make sense. So the abbreviations just look like letters, but if you unpack these letters, they will start to make sense. Hypothalamic releasing hormones and anterior pituitary hormones. And we're going to focus on this side of the slide for the next few hours or so. Yeah.
So again, what's the difference between what's being carried at the top in that box that says portal blood vessels carry and what's actually being released in the bottom? Are you saying that those then trigger the release of the bottom list into
Yeah.
the general
The
blood?
top list is released, carried by blood to the cells of the bottom of the anterior pituitary that trigger the release of the bottom list. And let's be specific. There are specific neurons that release GHRH that trigger the release of GH from specific cells of the anterior pituitary. We're going to talk about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different classes of cells of the anterior pituitary. There is a class of cells that releases GH. And I'll start to unpack those names on the next slide. The cells of the anterior pituitary that release GH are triggered to do so by GHRH. The cells of the anterior pituitary that release ACTH, that's a hormone you've already heard about, are triggered to do so by CRH. Okay, so we're going to start to unpack that, the names and the functions. But before I do that, I want to come back to the point that I left at the end of the class on Tuesday, which was this concept of feedback. So hypothalamic releasing hormones are released into the portal circulation, bind to cells of this is really the anterior pituitary. So you should decorate your handout with the word anterior pituitary, because this is not this part. It's not really true for the posterior. The pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary, releases hormones. Some of them have direct effects, like cortisol. But some of them trigger release of other hormones from other glands in the body, like the thyroid. There is feedback to help homeostasis, because too much hormone is bad and too little hormone is bad. So the hypothalamus is a positive feed-forward driver here. Hypothalamic hormones stimulate the pituitary. Pituitary hormones stimulate something. Let's just say the thyroid or another gland, adrenal, to release other hormones. This is a positive feed forward. And for most of what we're going to talk about, with the exception of female reproductive endocrinology, we're going to be talking about negative feedback. So the hormones of the anterior pituitary get into the blood, right? So they go everywhere, including to the hypothalamus eventually, and cause negative feedback. So positive feed forward, negative feedback, and so you can imagine, okay, the level of this pituitary gland hormone is going to go up in response to the hypothalamus, and then going to go down if it gets too high in response to negative feedback. So it's going to go up and down and up and down, and you like to think it would be a nice smooth sine wave, but it's not. It's all noisy in response to feed forward and positive feed forward and negative feedback. But there is homeostasis. It's going up and then it's going down. It's going up and then it's going down. The feedback from the pituitary to the hypothalamus is called short loop because because the pituitary is right next to the hypothalamus. But it's not really a short loop because it gets into the systemic circulation in order to do this negative feedback. And then the feedback from other hormones, either to the pituitary or to the hypothalamus, both of which are negative, most usually, with the exception of female reproductive endocrinology. Negative feedback, and this is called long loop, but it's the same blood flow as the short loop. Right? So I am not going to make a big point about short loop and long loop because it's kind of misleading. I do want you to understand negative feedback from the pituitary to the hypothalamus or from the systemic circulation to both, either the pituitary or to the hypothalamus, as a form of keeping the concentration of hormones under control. Leah?
I understand that it's like positive, like the stimulating hormones from the pituitary gland and like also exciting the release of these other hormones in the glands. But I'm just confused on how those same stimulating hormones can be like not necessarily excitatory but can also stimulate the release versus
Different receptors.
Okay.
So the receptors for a pituitary hormone here are not, so these glands have a kind of receptor, or at least a machinery, a cellular machinery, that responds to the pituitary hormone that is different from the receptor or responsive machinery expressed by the hypothalamus to the same hormone. Different receptors and or different coupling mechanisms intracellularly. Same hormone, different cellular responses. So here's an example of a feed-forward loop. And I'm starting to use the language of this endocrine system. This is an example. This is thyroid. So in the hypothalamus, there are neurons, neurosecretory cells, that release TRH. You can see how I'm starting to unpack the letters. TRH is called thyrotropin releasing hormone, TRH. TRH gets into the portal circulation and then into everything else. It binds to TRH receptors of the anterior pituitary and activates them to release TSH. TSH is released into the systemic circulation and it stimulates the thyroid to release TH. Well, we don't call it TH, we call it T3 and T4. I apologize, but that's just the way the world works. So TRH stimulates the pituitary to release TSH, which stimulates the thyroid to release T3 and T4. T3 and T4 go throughout the body from the thyroid and have multiple effects on the brain, on the heart, on skeletal muscle, on behavior. Thyroid hormone does a lot of things, including negative feedback to the pituitary and to the hypothalamus to prevent hyperthyroidism. If you didn't have this negative feedback, you would probably be hyperthyroid. No question, Abe?
Okay, well, just to be clear, did you say the long feedback loop could be negative or positive depending?
Let's just talk about negative. It's not until we get to female reproductive endocrinology that we need to think about positive. So let's just focus on negative.
So both the long and short loops are generally negative for now.
Yes. Okay, so here's an important slide because this unpacks the names of that alphabet soup from the previous slide. I mean, from the cartoon slide. So here is TRH. I'm just doing the one that we just did. TRH from the hypothalamus triggers TSH from the anterior pituitary. And the names are somewhat helpful. These are the releasing hormones. They trigger the release of other hormones. So these are all RHs in a way. GHRH, CRH, TRH, GnRH. So let's go through them. I'll try not to rush. So there's a hormone from the hypothalamus called growth hormone releasing hormone, GHRH. And it stimulates some cells of the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. Growth hormone, the name, now this is a key new bit of information. The name of the cell type in the anterior pituitary that makes and releases growth hormone in response to GHRH are called somatotrophs. Somato, body, they are somatotrophs because growth hormone determines body size. It's one of the important hormones of body size. Yes?
Can you explain what they are?
What?
Like what they are, like the sentence before you.
These are all peptides. Is that what you meant?
No, like the sentence right before you said what they, like this somatotrophs. Like you said there's something there, or what they did.
I'll try it again.
Yeah.
So the hypothalamus releases GHRH into the portal circulation at the median eminence. GHRH travels through the portal circulation, the anterior pituitary, and binds to GHRH receptors on the somatotrophs of the anterior pituitary, triggering them to release growth hormone. The thing that defines a somatotroph from a corticotroph is the expression of GHRH receptors and not CRH receptors. So the somatotrophs of the anterior pituitary express GHRH, and they express the genes necessary to make GH, growth hormone, and release it in response to GHRH. That's what defines a somatotroph.
Then they're cells, correct? They're cells, right?
They are cells. These are endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary. Somatotrophs are endocrine cells that release growth hormone in response to binding of GHRH. And they're specific for GHRH because they only express, they express GHRH receptors and they don't express TRH receptors. Because they are somatotrophs, not thyrotrophs. Okay? So I'm using the language, but it gets easier because the pattern gets established, and we're pretty good at pattern recognition, and that's your job, is to establish the pattern and then apply the specifics. So GHRH from from the hypothalamus, released into the median eminence and getting into the portal circulation, travels through the blood to the anterior pituitary, binds to GHRH receptors, triggers GH release from somatotrophs that express the GHRH receptors. The GH goes everywhere. All of your cells in your body have GH receptors, and that determines growth. Obviously, these are extremely important in childhood and become less important, but not unimportant, in adulthood. Okay, another one. CRH stands for corticotropin releasing hormone. Why is this not called ARH? right? I mean, you'd say, wait a second, it's triggering the release of ACTH, so it should be called the ACTH releasing hormone, right? If you follow the pattern. But unfortunately, ACTH has another name called corticotropin. So many things are named twice, or different names. So the synonym for ACTH is corticotropin. So CRH, released from the hypothalamus and the median eminence, going into the portal circulation, getting to the anterior pituitary, is recognized by the corticotrophs of the anterior pituitary, because they express the receptor for CRH, the CRH receptor, respond to that binding, and release ACTH, which, as you know, is a peptide, released, cleaved out of PLMC. ACTH has multiple targets, but its primary target is the adrenal cortex. Here's the one that was illustrated right here. So now we're getting to this one. Thyrotropin releasing hormone is released from the hypothalamus at the median eminence into the portal circulation, where it flows everywhere, but the cells that respond to it are the cells in the anterior pituitary called thyrotrophs that express the TRH receptor, and in response to binding and activation of the TRH receptor, they release TSH. So now you know another name for TSH. What is it? Thyrotropin. If you make a mistake, and I ask you for the names, not the abbreviations, and you call this thyroid-releasing hormone, and you call this thyroid-stimulating hormone, I'll be okay with it, but it's not right. Just to be clear. Here, TSH is in fact thyroid-stimulating hormone. Let's unpack it. So GH is growth hormone. ACTH, adrenocorticotropin hormone, corticotrophic hormone, so not a very helpful name. Thyroid-stimulating hormone is stimulated to be released by the thyrotrophs in response to binding of thyrotropin releasing hormone. Okay? Another one, gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. You gotta pay attention to the N, because gonadotropin releasing hormone is not the same as GHRH. GnRH and GHRH are not the same. They're real different. They do very different things. Your body can tell the difference, and so you have to know the difference. GnRH, released from the hypothalamus in the median eminence, at the median eminence, into the portal circulation, goes everywhere, but the targets are the gonadotrophs of the anterior pituitary that express the receptor for GnRH, and in response release two hormones: follicle stimulating hormone. So these are names to write down because it's the name for FSH. Follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. So those are hormones that you might be associated. Luteinizing is L-E-U-T-I-N-I-Z-I-N-G. I'm sure you can't see it over there. Right. And I think I'm spelling this right.
Well, we expected also know where exactly, so like, for luteinizing and the follicle stimulating hormone, do you want us to know like the specific targets that we're going to go to after the anterior pituitary one?
You will. You don't know them yet. So follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Women probably have already heard of these hormones, LH and FSH. These are the hormones of the female reproductive cycle. Men have it too. We men have follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone as well, and it's important for our endocrinology, our reproductive endocrinology, but we don't cycle. So this is not just females. This is males and females. Here, in this story, dopamine is, you know that dopamine is a neurotransmitter. It's the neurotransmitter released by the cells from the substantia nigra at the putamen, globus pallidus, etc. That's a neurotransmitter, but it's also a hormone. There are cells of the hypothalamus that release dopamine into the portal circulation at the median eminence. Goes everywhere as a hormone, but its primary target, at least in this story, is that dopamine binds to the lactotrophs of the anterior pituitary and inhibit. Now we've got a exception to the rule. Dopamine inhibits the release of prolactin, which doesn't have a abbreviation, so we just call it prolactin, from the lactotrophs. I bet you can tell by the name what this hormone is important for. Lactation, following childbirth. And we have a hormone, so now we've got another hormone called somatostatin, released by the cells of the anterior pituitary. Nope, released by the cells of the hypothalamus into the portal circulation. That inhibits growth hormone release from the somatotrophs. It inhibits TSH release from the thyrotrophs. It inhibits insulin release from another endocrine gland, the pancreas, that we haven't mentioned yet. And it stimulates glucagon release, I think. Somatostatin. I'm not sure about this one, so I'll have to clarify whether this is an inhibition of all of these, or I think it is. Yeah, I think it's an inhibition of all of these. So somatostatin and dopamine are negative feed-forward hormones, breaking the rule that I set up earlier today. Exceptions to the rule. There's always that, for every rule. I don't know. So this is an important slide to commit to memory and to draw but not just to memorize the letter connections, but to understand that the lactotrophs express dopamine receptors, inhibitory dopamine receptors, whereas the corticotrophs don't. The corticotrophs express CRH receptors, stimulatory CRH receptors. Yes?
So are the lactotrophs constantly releasing prolactin when there's no stimulation by dopamine?
We are constantly releasing dopamine to keep the lactotrophs under control. I'm getting ahead of myself, but at parturition, after childbirth, there is a inhibition of dopamine release. So a release of this inhibition, which triggers prolactin in the female who has just given birth. For the rest of us who are not giving birth, we have constant inhibition.
What inhibits the dopamine?
Other neurons, yeah, it gets complicated, right? So now we are going to get into the target cells. Somebody asked about, do we have to know the target of LH or FSH? You didn't before, but now you do. Okay? So let's be clear. Now we're talking about anterior pituitary hormones. The hormone we're talking about here in this panel, this part, is ACTH, released by corticotrophs in response to what hormone? CRH. ACTH, where does it go? Everywhere. Everywhere. It goes everywhere. But the cells that express, the cells that we want to focus on, that express the ACTH receptor, are in the adrenal cortex. And luckily the AC and adrenal cortex sort of match, but that's not what the name comes from. This is not adrenal cortex something. It's adrenocortico something. But adrenocortico something binds to receptors of the cells of the adrenal cortex, and it triggers the synthesis and secretion of steroid hormones like cortisol from the adrenal cortex. So you can put in your box here, paren cortisol, as one of the important effects of ACTH on the adrenal cortex. TSH from the thyrotrophs of the anterior pituitary, stimulated by what? TRH. TSH, released by the thyrotrophs, goes everywhere, but the TSH receptors are expressed on the thyroid, on the cells of the thyroid gland, and stimulates them to synthesize and release what? T3 and T4. Those are the thyroid hormones. Say that again?
But isn't it T4 is released but converted to T3? So technically it's not. Because there's a conversion at
T3 has an effect. T4 is converted to T3. But this is not a detail I want you to pay attention to. The thyroid releases T3 and T4. Does that answer your question? The somatotrophs of the anterior pituitary release growth hormone in response to what? GHRH. GHRH stimulates the somatotrophs of the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. It goes everywhere and has many effects. Transcription, translation, cell division, all kinds of effects. What's the official biological word for many effects? There's a word that begins with a P. I'm just curious whether any of you have heard this in any of your other biology classes. Pleiotropic. It's a good word to know. Pleo, P-L-E-I-P-L-E-O, I don't remember. Look it up. Pleiotropic effects just means multiple effects.
Can they converge or just?
They can converge or they can diverge. Many effects. Giving you a upper level word that can be helpful. Pleiotropic effects on pleiotropic cells. Pleiotropic effects on many cells for growth and survival and division of cells. It's especially important in childhood, up to about puberty, when our bones stop growing. But the rest of our cells don't stop growing. It's just our bones that stop growing. And that determines how big you are. At least how tall you are. FSH from the gonadotrophs of the anterior pituitary. Stimulated by what? GnRH. Have targets in the female and male gonads. In the female, FSH, I'm getting ahead to female reproductive endocrinology. FSH triggers the maturation of the cells that will become the ovum. And in the male, FSH stimulates the production of sperm. Luteinizing hormone. There's a blank here. What cells release luteinizing hormone? What cells, what's the name of the cells that release luteinizing hormone? And there's the, so there's the correct spelling. I got this wrong, so I'm gonna erase it. There's the spelling of luteinizing. What cells produce luteinizing hormone? Gonadotropes. Gonadotropes respond to what? GnRH to release luteinizing hormone as well as FSH. Luteinizing hormone has targets in the female and male gonads. In the female, it stimulates the release of a developed ovum, ovulation. We'll talk about this when we get at the very end of the class, when we get to reproductive endocrinology. And in the testes, in the male, luteinizing hormone stimulates the release of androgens. What's the most famous androgen? Testosterone. So these slides are packed with information to put into a framework of understanding. Here is a slide from your textbook that has exactly the same information. GnRH stimulates the, what are the name of the cells here? Gonadotropes, and the effects of the end hormones from the gonadotropes. Growth hormone stimulates and somatostatin inhibits what cells? Somatotropes that have multiple pleiotropic effects. Or the hormone from the gonadotropes, called growth hormone, has pleiotropic effects. TRH stimulates the what cells? Thyrotropes to release TSH, which stimulates the thyroid to secrete T3 and T4. This is T4 and this is T3. And more names. Just call it T3 and T4. Dopamine chronically inhibits the what cells? Lactotropes, to prevent the development of breast and milk. And CRH from the hypothalamus, from the hypothalamus, stimulates the what cells? Corticotropes to release ACTH that stimulates the adrenal cortex to release cortisol and other steroid hormones. Okay, so this slide packs a lot of information and it has sort of a slightly more graphic, but it has less information because it doesn't tell you the names of the cell lines. Here are the, okay, so now we're going to jump and then we're going to take a break. These are the hormones of the posterior pituitary. Do we have RHs in the posterior pituitary story? No, we don't have RHs because the hormones of the posterior pituitary were synthesized in the hypothalamus and released in the posterior pituitary. And the two most important are vasopressin, which has effects on the kidney, which you have to take the other AMP class to understand, and oxytocin has effects on the mammary gland and on the uterus, and if you have one, and the brain, which we all have, to have pleiotropic effects. We will talk about oxytocin in the context of lactation after childbirth. We will talk about oxytocin in the context of childbirth. We will not talk about oxytocin in the effects on the brain in terms of mating and pairing behavior. That's past our abilities. We just don't have time for it. Very interesting. Vasopressin has another name called ADH, which we will talk about in the other AMP class. Posterior pituitary. Don't get these confused with the anterior pituitary ones, because that would be a mistake. Let's take a break and we'll come back and do some quickers. This is just, I mean, obviously this is not closed book, you can look at your notes, but on an exam, that's not true. Which of the following are hormones that are released at the median eminence? Released at the median eminence. Dopamine and GHRH are both released at the median eminence. FSH and TSH. FSH and TSH are released at the anterior pituitary into the systemic circulation, not into the portal circulation. Which of the following is true of the anterior pituitary? It is the location of nerve terminals for some hypothalamic neurons? No, what am I describing there? The posterior pituitary. That would be a reasonable description of the posterior pituitary. Each endocrine cell in it releases a mixture of hormones? No. Corticotropes release ACTH. Da-da-da-da. A subpopulation of cells release TSH? What do we call that subpopulation of cells? Thyrotropes. It receives blood flow from the hypothalamo-pituitary portal-arterial system. Yeah, that's true. Okay, let's do some more. And then maybe we'll skip a few and get to more content. For gonadotropes in the anterior pituitary, which of the following are true? Good, they're all true. Questions about that? What is a germ cell in this environment? We're talking about sperm and egg, and this FSH and LH released by the gonadotropes are important for the development of sperm and egg. LH and FSH are important for the development of testosterone, which leads to male phenotype, and estrogens, which leads to female phenotype. So they're important for sexual development. For lactotropes in the anterior pituitary, which are true. Is also true. Did I get that right? Because all of you got it wrong.
Generation.
Lactotropes, they don't respond to GnRH, they respond to prolactin. I got that wrong. I will fix that on the slide. So D is the only correct answer. Why are they more important in females than in males? Because females produce milk and males don't.
Don't they only respond to dopamine and then they release
They respond to dopamine,
Mhm.
but they,
release prolactin and
let's go back. Do they respond to GnRH and dopamine? No, actually, I got them both wrong.
no wait.
The lactotrophs, I got it wrong. The lactotrophs respond to dopamine and release prolactin. They do not respond to GnRH. They do release prolactin. The lactotrophs release prolactin. The lactotrophs release prolactin that have an effect on the breast, male and female breast, but male breasts are useless. Yes.
I heard that like under certain extreme environmental circumstances, males can lactate. Is that
Yeah,
true?
that's why. Okay, so I'll fix that on Moodle. Sorry about that. So now let's spend the rest of the class talking about the stress response. So here is where we're going for the rest of the course. Just want to make it clear. This is an outline for the rest of the course. This is going to carry us into final exams. We're going to talk about stress today. Then we'll talk about metabolism, and we'll talk about hormones of metabolism, two of the many important hormones of metabolism, insulin and glucagon. We'll talk about some of the important hormones of growth and metabolism, thyroid and growth hormone. We'll talk about some of the important hormones that help us control thirst and hydration and dehydration, vasopressin, and we might not even get to these, but we will talk about the hormones of female and male reproductive endocrinology. So this is where we're going. So today we're talking about stress. Now, do you think you evolved in a context of the sort of medium to low to medium level, evolutionarily, what you're experiencing as stress right now is not life-threatening? Do you think I hope it's not. Do you think this is the kind of stress you evolved to experience and to respond to? No. What is the kind of stress that you evolved to experience and respond to? A tiger chasing you. A tiger biting your leg, causing blood loss, but didn't kill you, and you still want to survive. I mean, you want to survive and pass your genes on to your children. Right? So you evolved in a situation of acute, short-lived stress. But we live in an environment of rare, short-lived acute stress. I mean, if you get into a car crash, that's an acute stress. But we are living in an environment of kind of tonic, chronic, low-level stress. So what we evolved to respond to, what we have adapted to, is now being used in an environment where it can be maladaptive, because we didn't evolve to experience weeks of stress, months, years. Nevertheless, stress is an important physiological thing, and we have ways to respond to it. The classic stress response is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So this is an axis, HPA, the HPA axis. So that's what we're talking about now. Stress is something we experience. Our brains detect it and tell the hypothalamus, you are under stress. You just lost a quart of blood. You just,
Failed an A&P exam.
what?
Failed an A&P exam.
You, okay, you just failed an A&P exam. You, that's one type, yes, right.
Right.
What is CRH? Let's unpack that word. Corticotropin releasing hormone. Where is it released?
See,
Where is CRH released? In the median eminence of where it travels into the,
anterior pituitary.
okay, anterior pituitary via the portal circulation.
This
Responds, what cells in the anterior pituitary respond to CRH? And what do they release? ACTH, it's right there in front of you. ACTH. Where does ACTH go? Everywhere. What cells express, thank you very much, what cells are we talking about that express the ACTH receptors? The cells of the adrenal cortex. The cells of the adrenal cortex are evolved to express ACTH receptors and to synthesize and release cortisol. Remember that complicated pathway that we had up on Tuesday of cortisol synthesis. What is the precursor that I do want you to know of cortisol? What is the chemical precursor that I do want you to know of cholesterol? That's the answer. The precursor to cortisol is cholesterol. Screw that up bad. Are the products of cholesterol metabolism limited to cortisol? No. Aldosterone, cortisol, estrogens, testosterone, progesterone, all of those steroid hormones come from cortisol, but come from cholesterol, but the one we're talking about is cortisol. Question? Yeah.
What's the point of that? Angiotensin circulating to the exercise the cortex that is asking about?
Well, eventually, okay, so it's going everywhere. So endocrinology seems pretty inefficient, but it's primitive. Animals developed an endocrine signaling before they developed neural signaling. And so does the ACTH that stimulates the adrenal cortex last forever in the blood flow? No, I don't teach this, but it's important to realize that there are enzymes that in the blood that will break down ACTH slowly. But if we give a dose of ACTH from the anterior pituitary into the blood and then never secreted ACTH again, it would eventually go away. So we're not always adding ACTH every time the anterior pituitary releases ACTH. There's a metabolic pathway that is slow, but it's there. And so cortisol does a number of things. Remember that pleiotropic effect. It's important for the control of blood pressure. It's important for the control of serum glucose. It inhibits growth and reproduction. Because if you're under stress, you don't need to be worrying about these things. It inhibits the immune response. So immune suppressants include the glucocorticoids. Now, I'm introducing a new word, but this is an important word. Because cortisol is related to glucose levels, it is called one of the glucocorticoids. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid. The receptor for cortisol is called the glucocorticoid receptor. And that's why I'm introducing this term, because the glucocorticoid receptor might be, it's one of the most important receptors in your body. Why? Because cortisol, what is cortisol required for that is really important? And not just lupus. Remember, what's the one thing that defines cortisol? You need it to survive. So activation of the glucocorticoid receptor by cortisol is necessary for sustained life.
You're saying the stress response is necessary for
This,
sustained life?
I'm saying that low-level stress response is, yeah, I guess that's what I'm saying. Low-level activation of the stress response. Getting out of bed in the morning is a stressor.
Tell me about it.
And that activates the stress response, and that dumps a little bit of cortisol into your body. Here is a cartoon from your textbook of a slice through the adrenal gland. So here's the adrenal gland. The kidney would be down here. Remember, the adrenal gland is on the superior, it's on top of the kidney. We will hopefully see it next semester when we open up the cadaver's thorax. The adrenal cortex produces cortisol, androgens, and aldosterone. The adrenal cortex produces cortisol, androgens, and aldosterone. I don't need you to memorize these names. So you can cross, did I give you this one? No? Yeah, it's right there. You can cross these names out and not force yourself to commit them to memory. I don't need you to know the layered structure of the adrenal cortex. But I do want you to know that the adrenal cortex produces, the cells of the adrenal cortex produce cortisol in response to what? ACTH. The cells of some cells of the adrenal cortex produce androgens in response to what? FSH. These are related, what hormone are these androgens related to that is not up on this screen? What's the most famous androgen? Testosterone. But testosterone levels produced by the adrenal cortex are low. But the adrenal cortex does produce androgens. And these are important for both male and female. Here's some hormones that you've heard of. What nervous system what nervous system are you aware of already where these neurotransmitters are important? Sympathetic nervous system. So the adrenal medulla, the middle, as opposed to the cortex of the adrenal, releases epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine is adrenaline, and norepinephrine is noradrenaline.
So it is, so you said it's just in the medulla, then it's not.
That's right. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are produced by the cells of the adrenal medulla, and these steroids, including cortisol, androgen, and aldosterone, are produced in the adrenal cortex. So I do want you to know that differential, but I don't care that you know this layered structure. And we're not going to talk about aldosterone in this course because that's talked about in A&P 2. But we are going to talk about cortisol and androgens. So here is an interesting flow chart that I show in both A&P classes. because you need both A&P classes to really understand it. But let's understand part of it today. Here's stress, activating the hypothalamus to release CRH. Here's the CRH releasing, traveling through the portal circulation to the anterior pituitary, causing the corticotropes of the anterior pituitary to release ACTH. ACTH travels through the systemic circulation, but activates the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol. Cortisol has pleiotropic effects that are necessary for life. This doesn't look like it's life-sustaining. Okay, inhibits the immune system, anti-inflammatory, prostaglandins. This list is limited.
What's the big thing it does to sustain life?
What does it do to sustain life? Cell growth. So the glucocorticoid receptor becomes a transcription factor that's necessary for cell division, cell growth, cell maintenance, all of the things that are necessary to keep cells alive.
Oh, okay.
But just to be a little clear here, cortisol is an immune suppressant. So some of you may have had the experience of getting inflammation and being treated with a glucocorticoid. It's not usually cortisol. As an immune suppressant to try to prevent inflammation, to lower inflammation. So, trying to think, prednisone. How many of you have ever taken or heard of prednisone? Prednisone is a glucocorticoid. It's an orally available glucocorticoid, and it's used to inhibit the immune system to try to prevent, to lower inflammatory responses. Prednisone, it's a weird drug. It also affects the brain. So it has way weird effects on the brain. Yes?
So is that a cortisone injection doing the same thing?
A cortisone injection. Cortisone is a derivative of cortisol. Prednisone is a variant of that too. They're glucocorticoid receptor agonists, and they inhibit the immune response. So this is the pathway that we've been looking at. There are some other effects. So when we get to vasopressin, we'll talk about vasopressin. And when we get to insulin and glucagon, we'll talk about this. But you may know that stress causes your heart to beat faster and to beat stronger. And that's norepinephrine and epinephrine talking. That's not cortisol talking. That's epinephrine and norepinephrine talking. When I mean talking, I mean epinephrine and norepinephrine activating your heart cells to beat stronger and faster, and we do that in AMP2. So a lot of this is AMP2, breathing rate, heart rate, blood pressure, but this green stuff is AMP1. I think that's the end. Oh, I just want to point out that, just like I said, waking up in the morning, getting out of bed, stimulates the release of cortisol. Those are data. It looks like a cartoon, but it's a cartoonized version of data. ACTH is going up and down because of positive and negative feedback. Cortisol is going up and down because of stimulated release of ACTH and metabolism.